So today we're going to be looking at Reconstruction, which was that time period after the Civil War in which we are attempting, the United States is attempting to rebuild the South. The South had really experienced a lot of hardship and destruction during the Civil War, as did, of course, the Union. So we're going to look into the different plans of Reconstruction, and we're going to look into how different people handled those plans. So the South, like I was just saying, after the Civil War, lots and lots of property loss. And that, of course, occurred because of destruction and because the workers were leaving those big plantations. They were so used to having those slaves that it was just kind of a really, it was a really big hit to them to not have those slaves to work their farms anymore. Additionally, the transportation network in the South had been essentially destroyed. Remember that one of the big parts of the Anaconda Plan was constricting the South, and that involved cutting off the railroads. So, I mean, it was just really kind of in shambles. There were a bunch of challenges for African Americans. They did gain their freedom, but with that freedom came a lot of challenges because the slaves had no money and they didn't have any education at all. So they wanted educational and economic opportunities, so it was one of the goals of Reconstruction to figure out exactly how to provide those educational and economic opportunities. And then there was the question of how to treat the South. There were a lot of legal and political questions regarding how the South would re-enter the Union, if it would re-enter the Union, whether there would be punishment after the Civil War. So all of that had to be answered during this time. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created in March of 1865. That was one of those methods of trying to help out those freed slaves, provided them with clothes, food, other things that they might need in order to be successful in the long run. So the Northerners disagreed over how to treat the South. But Lincoln was a firm believer that the South should rejoin with very little punishment. He said, with malice toward none and charity toward all. So he was really still trying to maintain that level of unity in the United States. New roles for African Americans were tested. Territories under Union control, freed slaves were hired to work on plantations for pay or were allowed to rent and farm on the land. So that was what was going on kind of in the northern parts. 40-acre plots in South Carolina and Georgia, coastal lands were given away, so slaves were able to get those 40-acre plots. There's a term called, it's 40 acres and a mule, and that's essentially some of, one of the things that the government gave some of these released slaves. Now the lands didn't end up being the best lands. It was not the best, payment method, but it was a step, I guess, in the right direction. In Louisiana, freedmen signed contracts to work for a year for wages. Some planters deducted basic items from the wages and little money was left over. This is called sharecropping. So essentially what would happen is that the slaves would stay on their plantations and they would get paid to be on those plantations. Unfortunately, that payment went right back to the plantation owners because the slaves had to pay for the rent to the land and they had to pay for the tools for the land. So it was really kind of a cycle that was not great, and sharecropping lasted in the South for too long. So you had a couple of different plans in Reconstruction. Lincoln's plan is the first one. He wanted a proclamation of amnesty in Reconstruction. That was delivered on 1863. That gave forgiveness to people who pledged their Union loyalty. And supported emancipation. So essentially people in the South had to take a pledge, take an oath saying, I promise that, I'm going to be a part of the emancipation cause and that I am loyal to the Union. When 10% of voters had taken the oath, a new state government could be organized. The new government was required to ban slavery, so 10% of a state's community had to take that oath in order for them to regain statehood within the United States. So it's called the 10% plan. Opposition. Lincoln's plan sparked a lot of debate in Congress. There were a lot of people who did not believe that the 10% plan was the way to go. Some thought that the power to readmit should only come from congressional approval. Others thought that the South had never officially left the Union, so there was no point in making them take this oath. So the president did not really live long enough to test out this wartime popularity, and was not really able to see his Reconstruction plan go into effect because he was, of course, assassinated. He was shot at Ford's Theater on April 14th of 1865, died the next morning from complications with that wound. John Wilkes Booth was the actor who shot Abraham Lincoln. He was a part of this conspiracy to not only kill Abraham Lincoln, but to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. So the two men who were responsible for killing these guys actually chickened out at the last minute. Moderates did not want a social revolution, but wanted to help and protect the freedmen, so they passed two bills, including a Civil Rights Act, in the wake of Lincoln's assassination. Additionally, Congress passed the 14th Amendment. This writes the Civil Rights Act into the Constitution and granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized within the United States, including slaves or former slaves. Republicans took control in the election of 1866 after the riots in the South, and those riots had really discredited Johnson, who was president at the time. Radicals had the votes that they needed to pass their Reconstruction Acts. The laws put the South under U.S. military control, which was really not a great thing for the South, and required them to draft new constitutions. And we're going to look at the new state constitution in North Carolina in class. Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act in March of 1867, and that helped to keep Johnson from using his power as Commander-in-Chief to interfere with reconstructions. So these radical Republicans really got the ball